Joining me now is GB News contributor and TV presenter Christo Fufas. Christo, great to have you back on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. Wow, huge news out of the UK today. Harry and Meghan are returning to Britain, of course, 6 years after Megxit. It's all over. From Montecito, what is your reaction to this news?
Gosh, what did we deserve to have such a treat of Harry and Meghan coming back to the UK? And I'm sure you can tell just how much I mean that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I tell you my biggest fear with this, but you're absolutely right. It's being reported, broken by the Telegraph newspaper, and they have basically got some intel saying that Harry and Meghan coming back to the UK, they have enrolled Archie and Lilibet into British schools. They will be living, though, as private citizens.
They arrived in California carrying something Hollywood could never manufacture: royal mystique. Their names opened doors, their story dominated headlines, and executives imagined an empire waiting to be built. But behind the invitations and enormous expectations, a humiliating question was already forming. What happened when fascination became scrutiny? For Meghan and Harry, America was supposed to represent more than escape. It was reinvention. They had stepped away from centuries of royal tradition, carrying something extraordinarily valuable: global attention. Their marriage had already become a cultural flashpoint. Their departure from royal life had ignited endless debate, and millions wanted to know what had happened behind palace walls. To Hollywood, that combination looked irresistible. They were famous, controversial, emotionally compelling, and surrounded by mystery. The possibilities appeared endless. But Hollywood has always had a colder side. Attention can resemble loyalty when someone is new, powerful, and impossible to ignore. Invitations arrive, executives call, famous acquaintances appear. Yet beneath the glamour sits an unspoken rule: fascination must eventually become results. Harry had never lived by that rule before. Inside the monarchy, his status existed before he entered any room. His name, rank, and history guaranteed attention. California offered freedom, but it also demanded proof. Projects had to perform. Relationships had to be maintained. Relevance had to be renewed. Meghan understood the entertainment world, but she was returning to it as someone completely transformed. She was no longer simply an actress trying to secure her next role. She was now one of the most watched women in the world, carrying expectations powerful enough to turn even a minor decision into a global argument. And that attention would soon become dangerous. Every announcement created anticipation. Every delay invited questions. Every cancelled idea risked becoming evidence of failure. Even absence could become a story if the right party, premier, or powerful circle moved forward without them. What followed would not be one dramatic collapse, but something more uncomfortable. Awkward headlines, strained partnerships, public jokes, fading enthusiasm, and moments that slowly chipped away at the image of an unstoppable new empire. The higher Hollywood had lifted them, the harder every setback would seem to fall. And the first real warning would not come from a palace statement or a hostile newspaper. It would come from the very industry that had once seemed desperate to welcome them. For a moment, the contracts seemed to prove every critic wrong. Streaming platforms, audio companies, producers, the world's biggest entertainment players appeared ready to bet on the Sussex brand. But Hollywood does not measure success in titles or headlines. It measures output, audiences, momentum, and suddenly, those glamorous deals carried dangerous expectations. The excitement that had followed Harry and Meghan into California was now becoming something colder: accountability. Announcements that once sounded like victory began to carry deadlines, budgets, expectations, and the quiet pressure to prove that royal fascination could be transformed into entertainment people would actually watch, hear, and return to. That changed everything. They were no longer simply the couple everyone wanted to discuss. They were creators expected to deliver. Every project in development raised anticipation. Every delay created questions. Every concept that disappeared before reaching the public left space for critics to fill with their own explanations. And in Hollywood, perception can become reality long before anyone officially says a relationship is in trouble. Executives rarely announce disappointment with dramatic declarations. The calls simply become less enthusiastic. Meetings become harder to secure. Projects move more slowly. What once felt urgent begins to feel optional. Then came the kind of rupture that could not be hidden behind polished language. When a major partnership ended, the story was bigger than one cancelled arrangement. It became a symbol. Suddenly, the California dream no longer looked invincible. The most uncomfortable part was losing control of what that ending meant. Business partnerships collapse every day, but Harry and Meghan were not ordinary clients. Every comment from an executive, every anonymous quote, every industry whisper was dissected for evidence. Were expectations too high? Was the output too slow? Had the mystique been overvalued? That was where embarrassment turned into something more dangerous. Criticism from tabloids could be dismissed as hostility. Criticism from inside the entertainment business landed differently. These were people who understood contracts, audiences, production, and commercial value. Their doubts carried a sharper edge because they seemed to come from inside the machine itself. And once the industry began questioning whether the Sussex brand could consistently deliver, another group noticed the opening immediately. Comedians, satirists, and cultural commentators who knew that nothing becomes a punchline faster than wounded prestige. Because losing a deal could be explained as business. Becoming the joke inside Hollywood's own rooms would be much harder to dismiss. There is a brutal moment in celebrity culture when criticism changes form. People stop arguing about you and start laughing. For Harry and Meghan, that shift mattered because ridicule required no investigation, no palace source, no leaked document. A punchline could travel around the world in seconds. And once that happened, the rules changed. Royal titles could command attention, but they could not control comedy. The carefully managed language of interviews, announcements, and personal revelations could suddenly be reduced to a single joke. Comedians, animated shows, late-night hosts, and awards show monologues did not need to explain every controversy. They only needed the audience to recognize the contradiction. One theme became especially tempting: the tension between wanting greater privacy and continuing to participate in highly public projects centered on personal experience. Whatever nuance Harry and Meghan believed existed between those positions, satire had no interest in nuance. It compressed everything into something simpler, sharper, and far more difficult to escape. That was the trap. Responding risked making the joke bigger. Remaining silent allowed it to circulate untouched. Showing anger could become another punchline. In celebrity culture, ridicule is uniquely difficult to fight because defending yourself can look like proof that the attack landed. For Harry, the shift was particularly brutal. In Britain, royal protocol had once surrounded him with ceremony and distance. In America, that protection vanished. He was no longer treated only as a prince. He was material, another famous figure whose contradictions could be dissected for entertainment. Meghan faced a different version of the same problem. She understood publicity, but this was publicity on an almost uncontrollable scale. Even carefully chosen appearances could be reframed, mocked, or stripped of their intended meaning within hours. The humiliation was not simply that people laughed. It was that the image once built around defiance, romance, courage, and escape was now being recoded through parody. And once an audience begins seeing powerful figures as comic characters, restoring seriousness becomes far harder than gaining attention in the first place. But ridicule was only one form of rejection. In Hollywood, the more dangerous signal often came without a joke, a headline, or even an explanation. The laughter was uncomfortable, but the silence surrounding certain doors would soon create an even crueler question. Were Hollywood's most powerful people beginning to keep their distance? In Hollywood, rejection rarely arrives in writing. There is no royal decree announcing that someone has fallen out of favor. Instead, the signals are smaller. A missing invitation, an unanswered call, a photograph filled with everyone except you. And eventually, people begin noticing who is no longer inside the room. For Harry and Meghan, that kind of silence carried a different weight. The business headlines had already raised questions, but Hollywood's status is measured in more than contracts. Private dinners, premieres, ceremonies, charity events, and invitation-only gatherings create an invisible map of who still matters, who is rising, and who may be drifting toward the edge. One absence proves nothing. Two can still be coincidence. But once the public starts watching for a pattern, every empty seat becomes loaded with meaning. That was the cruel irony. Harry and Meghan had left one hierarchy only to enter another. The palace had rules written into centuries of protocol. Hollywood's rules were softer, quieter, and often more brutal because nobody admitted they existed. Access mattered. Relationships mattered. Being seen with the right people mattered. And fame itself could become a complication. Celebrities protect their own image carefully. A friendship that once seemed glamorous can begin to feel risky if every interaction generates distracting speculation. Nobody has to publicly sever ties. Distance can happen silently. That silence was exactly what made it powerful. Photographs of major stars, producers, philanthropists, and cultural figures together became their own kind of evidence. Who attended? Who was missing? Who still appeared beside whom? Entertainment commentary could turn ordinary social choices into clues, feeding the idea that Hollywood's initial excitement around the Sussexes was beginning to cool. Whether the distance was real, exaggerated, or completely imagined almost became secondary. The narrative could sustain itself. A missed event produced speculation. The speculation created headlines. Those headlines made future association seem more complicated. Then another absence appeared, and the cycle started again. For Harry, the emotional cost was sharper. Britain had surrounded him with relationships built before he could choose them. California required something entirely different. Building influence without the institution that had once guaranteed his place. And that made every closed door feel heavier than the last. But social exclusion, real or imagined, could still be blamed on gossip. The next humiliation would be harder to hide, because it involved the one thing Hollywood respects above almost everything else: commercial momentum. Royal fame had given them something almost no newcomer receives: instant global recognition. But recognition and brand power are not the same thing. A brand must tell audiences what comes next. And as projects changed, partnerships ended, and public enthusiasm became harder to measure, an uncomfortable possibility emerged: the Sussex name might be famous without being unstoppable. That distinction mattered. Fame could guarantee curiosity, but it could not guarantee loyalty. Millions might click once because of the name, the controversy, or the royal connection. The harder challenge was convincing them to return. Hollywood rewarded consistency, and Harry and Meghan were carrying too many identities at once. Former working royals, advocates, producers, media personalities, philanthropists, entrepreneurs, and parents who also spoke about protecting their private lives. The more roles they occupied, the harder their public identity became to define. Every new venture now seemed bigger than itself. A program was not judged only as a program. A company launch was not merely a business move. Each became another test of whether the entire post-royal experiment was working. If something slowed, changed direction, or disappeared, critics could present the shift as another reinvention. And reinvention had a cost. At first, changing direction could look ambitious. Over time, repeated announcements risked creating fatigue. Audiences began asking not only what Harry and Meghan were doing, but what they actually wanted to be known for. That question exposed their deepest strategic trap. The royal story remained their most powerful source of attention. Personal revelations, palace conflict, and the drama of departure could still dominate headlines. Yet every return to that territory strengthened the accusation that the institution they escaped remained the engine of their relevance. Moving away from royalty offered independence, but possibly less immediate fascination. Returning to it promised attention, but reopened every old contradiction. Gradually, the conversation shifted. They were no longer discussed only as rebellious royals challenging an ancient institution. Increasingly, they were being judged like any other celebrity enterprise, by momentum, clarity, audience interest, and whether the next idea could outperform the last. That pressure was about to become intensely personal. Because if the couple's shared brand was becoming harder to define, Meghan's next challenge would be even more exposed, proving that she could command attention without placing the royal rupture at the center of everything. For Meghan, Hollywood was not some mysterious foreign kingdom. She had worked inside the industry before royalty transformed her life. Returning should have felt familiar. Instead, every move now carried impossible weight. A launch was never just a launch. It became a worldwide test of whether Meghan could succeed entirely on her own terms. The return carried a strange sense of full circle. Before palaces, titles, and global controversy, Meghan had understood the rhythms of entertainment: image, timing, opportunity, and reinvention. But now she was stepping back into that world with a level of recognition that changed everything. She was no longer fighting to be noticed. She was fighting to control what that attention meant. And enormous fame could become its own burden. A business idea that might have developed quietly for another entrepreneur became immediate public property. Branding decisions were dissected. Timelines became talking points. Product expectations grew before anything fully arrived. Every announcement carried the weight of the Duchess attached to it, transforming normal commercial uncertainty into a public referendum. That made delays especially dangerous. In ordinary business, launches shift, concepts evolve, plans change behind closed doors. But under relentless celebrity scrutiny, every pause could be interpreted as confusion, every adjustment as retreat, every unfinished step as evidence that something had gone wrong. Worse, almost nothing remained neutral. Supporters could see patience, careful planning, and a woman building beyond the monarchy. Critics could look at the same development and see hesitation, overreach, or another reinvention struggling to take shape. Meghan might describe a project in one language, only to watch headlines reconstruct it into a completely different story. That loss of narrative control raised the emotional stakes. Success would mean more than commercial victory. It would represent independence, a powerful answer to those who believed her relevance depended entirely on royal conflict. It could validate the entire California chapter. But disappointment would carry the opposite message. Critics would portray it as proof that extraordinary fame had not become lasting cultural authority. And while Meghan faced pressure to prove she could build a future beyond the palace, Harry was wrestling with something even harder to reinvent: himself. And while Meghan tried to build something recognizably hers, Harry faced a more unsettling transformation, discovering what remained when the prince was removed from the palace, but the world still refused to forget the title. Harry had spent his entire life being recognized before he entered a room. Security, ceremony, duty, family history. His identity came wrapped in an institution centuries older than him. California offered freedom, but freedom carried a hidden cost. Without the palace, Harry now had to answer a question royalty had postponed. Who was he? That question followed him everywhere. As a working royal, purpose had been built into the position. There were duties, causes, appearances, expectations. None of it depended on ratings, audience retention, or whether the public remained fascinated. But outside the monarchy, importance worked differently. In Hollywood, relevance had to be renewed, again and again. That made every interview, business relationship, advocacy project, and media appearance feel like more than work. Each became part of a larger attempt to define Harry after the palace. Yet the harder he tried to establish that identity, the more aggressively the outside world seemed to simplify him. To some, he became the angry prince. To others, the homesick prince, the celebrity husband, the royal who demanded freedom but remained commercially tied to the story of royal conflict. Serious attempts to discuss grief, mental health, family, veterans, or personal purpose could be swallowed by the louder question of what his departure from Britain really meant. And that created a uniquely personal humiliation. His inner life became public entertainment. People who had never met him debated whether he was liberated or isolated, thriving or regretful, controlled or finally free. Every expression was interpreted. Every appearance became evidence for somebody's theory. Even his partnership with Meghan came under that pressure. They had built their American identity together, but the same public brand did not necessarily require the same future from both of them. Meghan's path increasingly pointed toward business, lifestyle, and creative independence. Harry's struggle seemed more tied to purpose, legacy, and the unresolved shadow of the institution that had shaped him. That was the deepest irony. The title he had tried to step beyond remained one of the very things that made him valuable in America. Prince Harry opened doors, but it also kept the palace permanently inside the room. And slowly, the separate incidents stopped feeling separate. By then, the danger was no longer any individual headline. Hollywood had begun doing something far more consequential. It was assembling the moments into a narrative of its own. Celebrity reputations rarely collapse because of one moment. They change when unrelated moments suddenly begin supporting the same story. A canceled project becomes evidence. A joke becomes evidence. A missing invitation becomes evidence. And once audiences believe they recognize a pattern, even ordinary setbacks can begin looking like confirmation. By this point, the separate pressures around Harry and Meghan were no longer being treated separately. Business disappointments, satire, social speculation, branding questions, and Harry's struggle for identity were being folded into one larger narrative. The details almost mattered less than the pattern people believed they could see. That was the danger of momentum. Once commentators decided the Sussexes were losing Hollywood, Every new development could be filtered through that assumption. A quiet month became proof of fading influence. A delayed project became another sign of trouble. A joke that might once have passed quickly now seemed to confirm a wider cultural shift. Even success became harder to protect. Positive announcements rarely carried the same emotional force as controversy. A new project could generate headlines for a day, but one awkward moment could reopen months of criticism. Harry and Meghan were forced into an exhausting imbalance. They had to keep producing evidence that the experiment was working, while critics needed only one setback to revive the entire case against them. The audience had split into camps. Supporters saw a familiar cycle of hostility and unfair scrutiny. Detractors saw vindication in every stumble. Between them sat a quieter group, and that group may have mattered most. They were simply becoming less interested. That kind of fatigue was more dangerous than anger. Anger still clicks. Anger still watches. But indifference drains power slowly. The couple who once represented an extraordinary break from royal control were now competing for attention like everyone else in an industry overflowing with new scandals, stars, and stories. And that changed the meaning of everything. The real humiliation may not have been one failed project, one joke, or one closed door. It may have been discovering that even royal fame has an expiration point in a culture addicted to novelty. And that question leads to the final twist, because the most painful Hollywood moment may not have happened at a party, inside a studio, or on a television screen at all. The cruelest rejection in Hollywood is not hatred. Hatred still means attention. The real danger is indifference. The moment people stop arguing, stop watching, and begin searching for someone new. After years of extraordinary fascination, Harry and Meghan faced the possibility no celebrity can control. What if the world simply became harder to shock? That possibility changes the meaning of everything that came before it. The awkward headlines, fractured partnerships, jokes, speculation, and relentless scrutiny were damaging not because any single moment destroyed them, but because together they exposed the most unforgiving truth about celebrity power. Attention is temporary. When Harry and Meghan arrived in California, they possessed a level of cultural fascination almost impossible to manufacture twice. Their story felt urgent. Every interview promised revelation. Every project carried the possibility of another glimpse behind the royal curtain. But Hollywood consumes stories quickly. What once feels explosive eventually becomes familiar. Scandals lose their shock. Revelations become old arguments. Documentaries, interviews, memoirs, and personal confessions enter the cultural bloodstream. And then the audience begins looking elsewhere. For Harry, the irony was especially painful. He had left an institution where significance was inherited and entered a world where relevance had to be continually earned. Freedom meant opportunity, but it also meant competition. For Meghan, the consequence was different. She achieved a level of global recognition far beyond her earlier entertainment career, yet that fame became inseparable from the royal rupture that transformed her life. The very conflict that amplified her voice also threatened to define everything that followed. That was the paradox at the heart of their Hollywood story. Breaking away made them independent figures, yet the monarchy remained the reference point audiences returned to again and again. Still, Hollywood narratives are never permanent. One unexpected success, one powerful reinvention, one major partnership can reverse years of criticism almost overnight. So this is not an ending built on defeat. It is something more uncertain. Their next chapter must overcome a challenge harder than hostility: familiarity. Because Harry and Meghan once proved they could make the entire world stop and watch them leave the palace, the question now is whether they can make that same world stop and watch what they build after it.